Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today what we're going to do is we're going to continue our series on how to build an incident response plan, policies, and procedures. Last time we talked about building an IR plan. Today we're going to focus on the policy side. So let's hop right in. So again, review of the NIST publication we're going to use for this. NIST 800-61 is a really good place to start. It's a government publication through NIST that kind of outlines things like how do you organize incident response, how do you handle incidents, and then things like coordination and information sharing, right? It's a good starting place. You definitely do need to tailor it to your specific organization or to the organization you're writing it for. But what it does is it provides a good initial starting place, so you don't have to start from scratch, defining your own. So today, like I said, we're going to follow the policy side. For the difference between policy, plan, and procedures, in case you didn't watch the last video, the policy defines the overall kind of enterprise approach, right? The objectives, the scope, the structure. This is what we're going to hit on today. The IR plan is kind of the intermediate level that says like, okay, this is how you're actually going to implement the IR capability on the organizational level. And then procedures are, when you say IR plan, a lot of people instantly go to procedures. These are how you do it on that tactical or actually on that hands-on level. Between the three, right? The policy, again, sets the overall intent for the incident response program for your entire enterprise. The plan's how you do it. Procedures are literally those hands-on, how you deal with the different types. So how do you build an IR policy? And again, we're talking about the entire organization. So here, what you need to start with is, what is management's role and what's their intent and how do you get their commitment on this? Because when you're doing incident response, you're often going to be in situations to where you need that management buy-in. You need the management buy-in to go say, hey, executive, we need your cell phone, we need your computer, and them tell you not to just pound sand and run off. Oftentimes, you need management buy-in for this. It's also important because when you're doing incident response, there's a lot at play for the business, right? When we talk about like why management cares about incident response, right? Some management might just care about the revenue side. Hey, if this system or if this network gets hit, we know we're going to lose millions of dollars not having this function of our business that's driven by computers in place. They could care about the legal or compliance side. You see this a lot with the North American power grid, where there's a set of regulations called NERC-CIP. The fines can be significant for not meeting the compliance requirements on, hey, you have 24 to 72 hours to report an incident to the government. Hey, you have to have these things in place. Depending on your industry, there are very real legal and compliance bars when you're defining your IR policy. And this might be something that your management's like, hey, we don't want to get fined. We want to do right by our customers, but our biggest concern also is not getting fined. In today's world, also, there's the reputation side. We've had cases to where clients have come in and they said, hey, we're more concerned kind of about our organization's ego, about our marketing, our branding. So we care a lot about incident response because we want to look good, if and when something happens. In today's world, incident response is less of an if and often more of a when, especially in the age of ransomware. Much less targeted attacks once you actually become, a decent sized organization. Even for our organization side, I'll tell you, we get phishing attempts all the time to all of our employees. So you don't have to be a very big company to have either those revenue-based hits or to have those concerns from the management side. Another thing on this, you need to know as you're writing the policy how management expects to be involved. If they expect to be involved at all. Certainly things from incident response the board might care about, but if you're a company that's like not really related to tech and there's computers, the board might not care a lot, to where if you're a tech company, the board might very much tell, right, or care. Or if you're in a highly regulated industry, right, the board will very much care, right, for that revenue or for the overall business concern. So defining that out is important because this first step will define the influences that play in your incident response plan. And it's important to understand their needs, wants, and motives because as you actually write out the IR policy, you need to make sure that those are all intertwined in and that you have that management buy-in. So once you understand kind of the management inputs to it and what they care about, then you need to actually go into the purpose and objectives of the policy, right? Go back to management's why, right? Are they talking a lot about revenue protection? Are they talking about litigation? Are they talking about reputation? This is going to kind of define the the way that you look at your incident response policy because you need to make sure to capture those concerns as you write the policy, right? What this also leads to is when you get to your key performance indicators, when you start to get to metrics, it's important to bring in those purpose and objectives and the why of both management and of your level, because when you start measuring things, that's what's going to be important to measure. Because oftentimes a lot of organizations will just measure the kind of generic things that people measure. But oftentimes, right, you want those measurements to actually be tied to how you're actually doing specific to your organization's interests. Purpose and objectives will also be very important for scope, which I think we'll talk about next. And that's why when we build these steps that we're talking through, we talk through them in the sequential way we talk through. So again, here, define the purpose and objectives, using kind of the inputs from the last step and also the inputs you put in, because here's the truth, management often doesn't understand incident response. If you're watching this, you're probably more in the shoes of having to write this. And so you're very much going to have to fill in the gaps or add in, the tradecraft and the understanding you have that your management might not have as, you go through that process of understanding it. Third, scope of the policy, right? Big one, who and what does this apply to? Again, is this based on revenue lines? Is this based on, hey, we're securing this revenue line, this product or this service that we're offering? We want to make sure we have incident response throughout all of the different organizations and components involved in this process. That might be one approach that you take in an IR policy to say, hey, the biggest revenue line of this company, is this given, is this given revenue line? So we're going to build our incident response process around making sure that revenue line stays up. It could be location or region based, right? A lot of places you'll have, okay, you're in charge of North American incident response. You're in charge of incident response for Europe. If you're a big organization, defining the scope here of what you are and aren't responsible for is critical. It could be business unit, right? They could say, hey, you are responsible for the industrial plants, right? This is a, industrial-based incident response plan. Hey, you're responsible for HR, for the call center, for, some other part of the business. Understanding the business units at play is critical because, again, that's going to drive when you actually get into writing policies and even your, or when you get into procedures and when you get into actually writing the plan. You're going to want to make sure your incident response plan and procedures that are based off this policy are grounded in what you're actually responsible for. Litigation and risk-based, again, for organizations that are very much concerned about the legal side, you want to make sure your IR policy does actually meet the scope of whatever that litigation or risk is. Again, we've mentioned North American bulk power grid. With the NERC-CIP regulations, if you're writing an IR policy, you definitely want to make sure that your IR policy, has those NERC-CIP elements. It's important so you don't get the big fines. Employee types in today's world, right? What are you responsible for when it comes to full-time, contractors, partners, vendors, remote workers? What are you responsible for and what do you have capacity to go to, right? If you're a remote workforce, or an entirely remote workforce or even partial, your IR policy needs to be suited to, hey, we have a good portion of our workers working from home. So we need to make sure this policy, has the legs under it, both in the procedure side and the plan side to deal with the fact that, hey, we are now a hybrid or remote workforce. So that's a lot of the who and what. You then get into what under what circumstances does it actually apply, right? This is where you get into those required times we were saying of, oh, we have to report this by this given time. We have to respond by this given time. Event types too, which we'll talk about, right? What events types does this IR policy get into? We'll hit event types in 2 slides, right? But things like, hey, root level compromise, things like, hey, a plan in this area was hit, right? All of those things matter. Revenue loss situations, right? Does this apply, again, if you're putting it against a revenue line and you're writing an IR policy for it, right? Are there situations to where a given revenue trigger will actually activate the IR policy, the plan, and end up in procedures actually being run? This is all very important because of the scope, and this is where when you talk about policy or plans coming out of policy and procedures coming out of plans, at this top policy level, this scope is where you really are setting what your policy and what your procedures are going to hit. And again, you're setting it at your entire enterprise level, including, maybe third parties and maybe other parts of your business, which aren't directly in physical spaces you own. Fourth, you have to define who is involved, right? So we talked about scope on the last slide. Now it's all about the organizations, their roles, their responsibilities, and their authorities, right? And how are those teams empowered, right? We talked about incident response teams that might have to go to an executive and take their laptop, take their phone. Oftentimes, you can get into situations to where that person is of higher authority in your chain. And this is where it's critical because as an incident responder under this policy, you want to make sure that incident responder can respond to a threat in a given time to really limit, right, that revenue loss. If you're doing a ransomware, right, you might say, hey, with auto-propagating ransomware, and especially ransomware we've seen that uses SMB, right, that can get around your network fast. Having authority within your defined, incident response teams and having that authority even, to deal with, organizations with more authority is critical, right? Also, what's critical is when are events reported, right? Who are they reported to? How do you deal with data protection and handling and data sharing, right? Because when you get into data sharing too, not just from the compliance side of you often have places you have to report it, but oftentimes too, your organization might want to limit who and what data people get access to. There's also often contractual requirements that vendors put in contracts that say, hey, if you're responding to an incident and you think you lost our data, you have X time to let us know, right? Data protection is key for the reputation of your organization, but also for those very important litigation steps that come through. Other legal or regulatory requirements, we've hit that quite a few times here again. But again, this is where you need to make sure that the organizations and that your IR team has the right authority so that you can meet those legal and regulatory requirements and not get fined. At the end of the day, some people ask, well, what if I don't have an IR policy? What if it's not up to date? What if it doesn't fit my organization? Defining this structure and getting that authority before the incident prevents a lot of wasted or lost time, right? Because once you hit an incident and once you're trying to hash this out while the building's on fire, the damage of that fire is going to be worse than if you had this defined out before. People understood roles, they understand the authority. They're not surprised when that incident response team shows up. Defining this is all very, very important going in. Fifth, you want to define your severity, right? So we defined scope. We talked about the authority they have. Severity is critical, right? For what type of events are you dealing with? Because then this is going to lead into, hey, what differences exist in how I handle incidents? What you see here on the left is actually, this is from a joint reg from the DoD about 10 years ago. On the left, you actually see the DoD's kind of categories of incidents, everything from a Cat 1 is root level compromise, right? Cat 2 is user down to reconnaissance, malicious code. I'm not saying you should necessarily adopt this, but this is a good starting point to say, okay, if I have a root level compromise incident, that could be very different from a user level or from someone just, reconnaissance, right? Someone just throwing nmap at your public IPs. But what this does is when you actually get down into your incident response plan and procedures, what this does is then define out different situations to where you can have an understanding to say, hey, if you have root level compromise of a domain controller in a revenue, in our top revenue generating plant, that's something you might wake someone up at 2 in the morning for, to where if, someone just nmap scans your public facing IP, you might say, hey, let's make sure we don't do that, or let's make sure they didn't get in, but you're not going to wake someone up at 2 in the morning. So severity is critical because, again, it's going to drive the posture and the importance within your program. On the right there of that graph, you also see DHS's old event categories, so I put them side by side. You can see between DoD and DHS at the time, the wording's a little different, but in the government, they kind of had the same categories going on at the same time. Again, just kind of a starting point, you need to tailor it for you and what you care about. Finally, metrics, reporting requirements, and contact forms, right? Again, this is where the incident types come in, right? Because how you measure, how you report these, who you report these to, and the forms that you use up on the policy level, these are somewhat going to be tailored to the incident types and to these, to the importance of the incident. It's also going to be scoped to the audience, right? So if you're sending this report to the board, or you're sending this report to a non-technical executive in the organization, that report's going to look different than if you're sending this report to IT, if you're sending it to another business unit that might actually have a deeper technical understanding than what the executive level does, right? And oftentimes too, when you scope it to that audience, you're going to tell the executive level, hey, we had this incident, this is kind of the severity, but this is also the importance, right? Because if you start talking about domain controller compromises and all that, you're going to lose them fast, to where if you say, hey, at our top revenue generating plant, someone got in, they had root level access, you kind of make it to where it's more approachable to that executive. And again, this should also be where you're aiming at meeting both the regulatory or contractual requirements, right? Because this isn't just kind of that NERC bulk power. In today's world, this is also things that, other companies and especially your partners might litigate you on if you don't notify them in time. So again, what we talked about today was how to build an IR policy. The IR policy is kind of the top enterprise level document, where the IR plan that we talked about in the last Tech Talk Tuesday and the IR procedures that implement that plan. The IR policy that we talked about today really is that overarching, really important document that has a lot of impact on the documents below it. So thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please drop them below, or if you have thoughts, and we'd love to hear what you thought. We'd love to help you out, and we hope to see you back next week. Thanks a lot.